Okay, it's 12 o'clock, so I think we should get started. I think Dr. Myers has a lot to talk about today. So first, I just want to welcome everybody to another installment of Webinars for Busy Lawyers. And today, Dr. Tracy Myers will be talking about coping with loss, including grieving a loved one, losing a job, or even loss of identity through retirement. All of these circumstances can be very difficult, especially during the holidays. I will introduce her in just a moment, but I also want to remind everybody of all the services that Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers offers. Along with our webinar for busy lawyer presentations, we provide assessments and consultations for addiction, substance use challenges, mental health concerns, and law office management. Our services are confidential and free. Our clinical staff are licensed professionals with many years of experience serving the legal community. And additionally, our Law Office Management Assistance Program, LOMAP, is run by experienced law office advisors to assist attorneys with technology, ethics, practice management, and more. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Tracy Myers. She is a licensed clinical psychologist who joined Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers in 2020. She has a strong commitment to integrative medicine for mental health and wellness and leads mindfulness and yoga programs for groups, individuals, professionals in the workplace. She also runs our Supermom support group, Mindfulness for Busy Legal Professionals, and Yoga for Busy Legal Professionals, as well as holds office hours and groups at Massachusetts law schools. Just a small housekeeping tip, please enter your questions into the chat and we will get to those after her presentation. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Tracy Myers. I think we might have lost her. Oh, that's a little technical problem. Is getting everything up and running. I do want to remind people that if you or someone you know is in distress or is thinking of harming themselves, please call 988. It is a confidential and free support line, and it is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So that's important to know again as we discuss this topic.
Okay, I am ready.
All right, excellent.
Okay, great. Okay, so we will start. All right. So thank you all for coming today. So I'll be talking about grief loss, some of the struggles as we are navigating what researchers call this push-pull when we're struggling with feelings of grief, sometimes moving in toward the grief, sometimes moving away from the grief. We'll talk about some strategies to help cope with grief and loss. And finally, those of you who have family members, friends, colleagues that are coping with loss, thinking about what to say and what not to say, right? We often read about like the top 10 worst things that people say when someone's going through a loss. So we're going to review a little bit of what could be supportive, what helps people. And then finally, some mindfulness and self-compassion tips for the season, which I can't help but not include as well. Okay. So I'd like to start by doing a brief little centering. As we're getting into the content, and as Amy gently reminded us, this can be activating and it's difficult even to think about loss sometimes, never mind going into some of the feelings associated with it. So I wanted to just invite us to take a few moments just to pause and maybe inviting yourself to come into a comfortable position, taking a few breaths, maybe feeling your feet on the floor. I'm doing this with you because I can feel my whole system a little bit activated. And if it feels okay, placing your hand on your heart. This is one of my favorite gestures. Whenever we notice a moment of struggle with ourselves, with someone we love, when we feel a wave of grief or sadness, just taking this moment to be with ourselves, to give ourselves tenderness. You might even imagine what you would say to someone who was struggling. You might say something like, I'm here, or I'm sorry. But we typically don't always offer that to ourselves, right? So in this soft landing, this invitation to offer ourselves a moment of grace, like, oh yeah, this is a moment of difficulty, or this is a moment of relaxation. I get to just be for an hour. If at any point during the presentation today, something may touch you or just feel a little tender, place your hand on your heart. It's just this little gesture. Researchers have shown that it can be soothing and even help us to secrete a hormone called oxytocin, the kind of feel-good hormone when we give ourselves tender, supportive touch. And when you're ready, you can remove your hand, come back to this moment. If your eyes are closed, opening your eyes. So I like to do this soft landing whenever maybe I'm going into a difficult situation, a meeting, or even like a family gathering as we're thinking about the holidays, right? It's like, okay, here we go. But before we go full steam ahead, can we just softly land for a moment? So as we start to think about the holidays, and we're well within the holiday season, first of all, it's really helpful to think about being among many, many people struggling. So, as we know, of course, the holidays are often supposed to be happy and exciting and fun. For many of us, it can be a really stressful time, whether we're coping with grief and loss, or whether we're struggling with physical health, mental health challenges. Often the holidays bring up expectations and then unmet expectations. And the discrepancy between what we want it to be like and what it actually is can be incredibly painful. It's a form of loss, right? When expectations aren't met, we can feel gripped with anxiety, sadness, depression. Many of us the last few years have really altered. The holiday ill, or people may have died, feeling that it's supposed to be different. So just kind of recognizing more intense during this time of year. And one thing I often share with people when you've had a loss is that it often manage loss in the healthiest ways at times, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about the traditional ways of thinking about loss and then some more psychological ways that might be helpful. So let's think about the typical holiday stressors, right? Family dinners, carpooling, all these things, right? And when something gets impacted, whether it is, a loss of a loved one that we used to do things with, or there's a financial loss, right? It can make it really, really difficult. And so often the joyful rituals get disrupted, and we might feel intense feelings of sadness, despair, loneliness, and anxiety. It's important to recognize that this is normal, right? Because that's one of the things people often say, I know I should be happy, but I don't feel happy. And so just to normalize that all feelings are normal, right? All feelings make sense. And often what we're encountering may be an unresolved loss from, it could be years ago, or it could be last year, or it could be right now. right? So I think about losses sometimes as threads that we're sometimes threading together when we're encountering that feeling. So it may have other losses attached to it as well. So what's the difference between sadness and grief? Sadness is a temporary reaction, right? And typically we can feel sad. It can last a couple of minutes. It usually passes within a couple of days, right? Um, if we think about sadness, we might be sad about a situation, but by 2, 3, 4 days, a week, we start to move on with life. Grief has a very different feeling to it, right? Grief is less emotional and it's more embodied. It has a more physical, cognitive, and psychological feeling rather than just an emotion that kind of passes through us. And so we talk sometimes about this embodied sense of grief. Heartbreak, right? Literally is in the heart space, right? We can feel viscerally grief in our bodies. And become really distracted, difficulty being present. So it's this kind of mixed intertwining of cognition, feelings, and body sensations. Okay. So again, sadness transient to a couple of days to maybe a week. Grief can last many, many days, months, or even years. So grief, and I apologize, this slide duplicated here, but grief is a natural process, right? But when someone has a prolonged grief, which extends more than a year, researchers have found that this is actually a different kind of form of grief than what we call typical grieving. Now, there is no limit on how long one can grieve, right? And there's no expectation someone should be over something just because it's a year. But psychologists have found that some people experience grief in a more profound way than others. And so in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 4, there's a 5 rather, there's been a revision in 2022. And in that revision, they included a new diagnosis called prolonged grief disorder. So prolonged grief disorder, which is a new diagnosis, is characterized by intense and persistent grief that causes problems and interferes with daily life. So intense and persistent, and that's really the piece that's important. Intense and persistent grief that causes problems and interferes with daily life. Here's the DSM-5. So essentially, it's really this intense longing or preoccupation. And this is not abnormal, but this is different than what we would say a typical course of grieving might be. In children and adolescents, it might be focusing on the circumstances around the death. The individual experiences significant distress and difficulty performing daily living activities. So it's really interfering with daily functioning. And it can be disabling, right? That's one of the differences between what we might call typical grieving and prolonged grief disorder. In addition, a grieving individual may have experienced, and I'm going to show you the symptoms in a moment, one of these, at least 3 of the symptoms described for at least every day for the last month. Okay. So as you look at these, you'll see that they are much more severe than what we might say a typical grieving reaction. So identity disruption, a marked sense of disbelief about the death itself, avoidance of reminders that the person is dead, intense emotional pain, anger, bitterness, difficulty reintegration, right? Difficulty doing normal daily activities, emotional numbness, feeling that life is meaningless, intense loneliness, and it lasts longer than what might be expected, right? So if someone has 3 or more of these and it's been lasting for at least a month after sort of the typical year of grieving, that's when we would start to consider a prolonged grief disorder. And it does help to distinguish because when someone is having a prolonged grief disorder, we would want someone to get help. Whereas in more typical grief reaction, a person may not necessarily seek psychological help. They may seek spiritual help. They may have, support groups and other things. But when someone meets this criteria, that's a signal that they may need to work with somebody, right? Let's talk about a typical grief model. And this is one of the most widely recognized models. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced her 5-stage grieving model all the way back in 1969. So a long time ago now. She has a book, very famous book called On Death and Dying. And she came up with these stages of grief. And there's been lots of research showing that they hold up to some degree, but other aspects of the model don't quite hold up. One of the things that's really key when thinking about these stages is not that someone goes through them in a linear way, right? So as you can see in that little picture up here, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. It looks like one just goes from one to the next. We know that that's not true. Some people experience only one of these stages. Some people skip one altogether. They may not experience anger, let's say. And sometimes people backtrack and people get to acceptance and then go all the way back to denial. So if we can think about it as a non-linear model that helps us explain some of the symptoms and some of the ways that we experience grief, it can be very helpful. If we use it as an expectation that it should go a certain way, it's less helpful, right? So I want to just introduce it or reintroduce it because most people are familiar with it, with this eye toward there are some benefit in each stage to processing grief. David Kessler recently documented a 6-stage. He added to Kubler-Ross's 5-stage model. And he talked about beyond acceptance, there's finding meaning. And he's basing that on this idea, lots of research based on this idea that people move through grief and often can find meaning as a result. And that helps the grieving process move all the way through. So we'll talk a little bit about his 6th stage in a moment. So denial is the first stage, right? And this is really, if you think about each of these stages as an important psychological mechanism, rather than judging it like, oh, someone's in denial, so they clearly haven't done enough work yet on their grief reaction. It's not that at all. It's this initial way to meet the psychological overwhelm that happens when someone has a loss, right? If someone dies or there's a breakup, right, or a loss of a job, initially, not being able to accept that right away is protective, right? There's a state of shock, right? Life has changed. And sometimes we need to take a moment or many moments before we can actually be with that, right? So if we think about this, this can actually help us pace our grieving. Because if we got so staggeringly overwhelmed, we might not be able to function at all. So denial or, sort of what seems like a lack of acceptance is a protection. And protections take as long as they take, right? So when I'm working with an individual who may be in this first stage, we're not trying to move through and say, you got to understand this has happened, right? You got to come on. It's not at all that. We actually want to be very gentle when someone's in this early stage because there's a lot of fragility here, right? The second stage of grief, according to Kubler-Ross and others, is now this anger stage, which is sort of like, why me or why did this have to happen? And anger doesn't come up for everybody, right? And so this isn't a necessary stage, but it's a common stage, right? Blaming self and others, one of the most common reactions I hear. I work a lot with people that have coped with chronic illnesses, and often they will say to me, I feel like I brought this on. I did something. I wasn't a good enough person. I didn't take good enough care of my health, right? So this interesting way that we could sometimes blame ourselves as a way of managing the overwhelm. And so again, mental health professionals have looked at anger and really feel like it's a necessary stage and that we can encourage it even to help people digest, right? It can be a pathway to reconnection. If people are feeling numb, disconnected, anger is a real visceral feeling, right? We can feel anger intensely in our bodies. It's a strong emotion. And sometimes that can be a pathway to reconnection, right? Helps us to feel something. And when people are feeling numb and dissociated, it can help us feel alive, right? And that's really important when we're feeling really cut off. So, of course, anger can get unhealthy, and recognizing that if anger isn't met with some skill building, some compassion, some kindness, it can cause ruptures in relationships. So the idea in anger, in this stage of grief model, is that it's a necessary stage to help reconnect with one's emotions, right? but we don't want people to stay there. And again, if someone's stuck here, this is where they might reach out for support. In any of these stages, it's appropriate to reach out for support, particularly as someone is moving more toward some of the feelings actually being felt and experienced. Negotiation, bargaining. This is a interesting stage, right? Because there is some acceptance, but there's also this kind of slippery slope of like, if only, or, I'm willing to trade this if I could have this. There's some cognition coming back online, right? Because people are accepting that there is some change, right? There's a recognition of the change, but there's also lots and lots of pain there. And our capacity to manage the pain depends on the day, depends on our own emotional makeup, how we're able to manage. So a lot of negotiation can happen when we're trying to reconcile the intense pain with the reality. And sometimes having this belief that we could bargain or if only, right, helps us to cope. Again, it's a stage where we're trying to really confront the reality of the loss, right? And people can stay in this sort of negotiation bargaining for quite some time. Depression. So depression is often a stage of grief. It's a natural and appropriate response, right? And, it's often, I don't even necessarily use the word depression when I'm working with clients around grief because it is different in some ways than what we might say a typical depression that's non-grief based. But the sensation of heartbreak, sadness, hopelessness, that is very common, right? In any kind of depression. But depression as a stage of grief is particular, right? Because it can feel very much like I can't navigate this loss on my own, a sense of being on my own and not able to move. It has a very somatic or body-based feeling, which is often feeling withdrawn, numb, stuck, isolated. This is where sometimes people have suicidal thoughts, right? What's the point of going on because this loss is just too painful, right? So depression in this stage is understandable, again, a natural reaction, and sometimes does require help, right? Especially if someone's becoming having suicidal thoughts or becoming really cut off and no longer able to engage in work-related activities or family life, right? So we're looking at a continuum, of course, when we're talking about depression. So one can have both a grief reaction and a clinical depression at the same time. But more likely for most of us, it's a stage, a temporary stage that can last several weeks, months, or in the case of prolonged grief, years. All right. So the final stage of grief is acceptance. And essentially, it's coming into this new reality that the loved one isn't coming back. And it's not the cognition. Of course, most people, even in the very early stages of grief, recognize the person's not coming back. But it's more about acknowledging the loss, being able to be with the loss, being able to understand life is going on, being able to rejoin life in some ways. So there's adjustment and readjustment continuously happening in this phase. And often people have good days and bad days. I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we kind of tend to move in and out of acceptance, really common. And people stay in this stage indefinitely, right? And what I see, especially around the holidays, to link it back to our topic today, is that when we feel like, oh, we've been in an acceptance stage for a while, suddenly it's Christmas time and we're thrown back, right? We're thrown back to depression or even anger in some of the earlier stages. So acceptance isn't a permanent stage, but it's a recognition of a more balance coming back into the world. So we're coming into this sort of moving back and forth stage. And for many of us, this is where we stay, right? It's like we get here and then we have some things, some other losses that may activate us, and then we come back. So moving back and forth between these stages, again, is natural. It's part of the healing process. And also can be a doorway into getting help if we're not able to move through it. All right, here's the sixth stage, which you may not be as familiar with. So David Kessler has written a book called Finding Meaning, the sixth stage of grief. Wonderful resource. He's a co-author with Kubler-Ross, so he's worked with her. And he talks about, and I quote him here, he says, it's not about finding meaning in the death, because there's really no meaning there. What it's about is finding meaning in the dead person's life and knowing how they shaped us, maybe in the way they died can help us to make the world safer for others. That's just an example. I don't want to limit this just to talking about the death of someone also, but finding meaning in loss in general, right? So it's the situation that caused the loss, whether it's a death, a breakup, getting fired from a job, a loss of our health, a trauma that's created a loss of safety, right? All of those are losses, right? But how can that help us make meaning, right? What does that help us do moving forward, right? And so it's really an integration, right, of looking at how what we lost now can shape our lives in hopefully a more productive way, right? So this is where a lot of healing can take place. Finding meaning is essentially what Kessler's saying. Finding meaning in this stage is where often a lot of healing happens. So it's the idea of growing and finding meaning, and also knowing that, of course, it's going to look different for all of us, right? And for those of you who are in earlier stages of grief, even knowing that there's this stage can be helpful. Doesn't mean you have to be here, and it can take years to get there. But often for people that have gone through a loss, this stage happens, and it happens kind of like, oh yeah, when you look back now, wow, look at all those things that I was able to learn from that and grow from that. I want to say that there is a lot of push and pull when we're thinking about grieving, right? And think about it for yourself. Those of you who are in an active stage of grief, or those of you who have gone through, and most of us have gone through some profound loss in our lives, right? You may notice that there is this push pull. There are times where you can really move toward the grieving, and there are times where you absolutely cannot. And I really find that is helpful to trust your system around that. So we engage in activities that are loss oriented sometimes, and sometimes we engage in activities that are restoration oriented. So why is this important? Why is this important to even know? So here's the thing. We often are doing this unconsciously, but we can make this more conscious as part of helping us navigate grief, right? So there are going to be times where loss-oriented activities are really helpful. And I'm going to share what those are in a moment. And there are going to be times where restorative or restoration-oriented activities are really important. And we want to trust what our system needs, right? All right, so what am I talking about? So loss-oriented activities. So when people are grieving, and maybe you respond to this idea, sometimes when you want to really think about that loved one and really like you're open and you want to just cry, you want to have a good cry. And it may be looking at pictures in a photo album. Maybe it's actively seeking out reminders of a loved one, maybe talking to your siblings if your parent passed away, or listening to music, heartbreaking music that just breaks your heart, but also opens you up, right? So sometimes there's this sweetness, this balm in a way of letting grief be with us, right? And it can make it, I think about it like a quivering heart. It lets our hearts kind of open up. And when we feel more open, sometimes there's healing. Sometimes we feel more connected to our loved ones that are alive. So there's this catharsis that can happen, right? And so there is a poignancy and an importance sometimes in moving toward these loss-oriented activities, right? But, or I'll say, and there are times where this could be flooding and really, really activating for our system. That's why I wouldn't say to someone, oh, go and look through an album and really think about your loved one that died, because this may be exactly what they can't do at the moment. So if you're drawn toward loss-oriented activities, you can trust that that's what is going to be helpful right now, right? But if you start to notice that you're flooded, that you're going into a place of dissociation, isolation, overwhelm, then you might gravitate toward what we call restoration-oriented behaviors. All right, so what are those? Restoration-oriented behaviors are activities that let ourselves minimize some of the distress and throw ourselves into other activities. So I think about like physical activities, right? Raking leaves, shoveling snow, cleaning the house, right? Things that are just like, I just want to get out of my head. I don't want to think. I want to feel productive. I want to move. I can't sit here any longer, right? And so that's good, right? That's totally fine. Spending time with people that help us laugh, right? We all need to have a friend who knows who's not going to take us too seriously and can help us laugh to move through something. Or we put on, our favorite comedian on YouTube, right? So restoration oriented behaviors are really important. And if we think about finding a balance and even letting ourselves have a little toolkit of both, right? Like, what are the activities that help me feel my heart, right? Get in touch with my heart. And what are activities that help me restore? And ideally, we have both and we move back and forth between both. So if you are someone who tends to incline toward one side versus the other, that's fine. But you might explore what would it be like to include a few of these restoration activities in, or if you're someone who never goes into the loss activities, maybe periodically spending a few minutes. But trust your nervous system, trust your emotions. They'll tell you whether this is too much or not, right? Too much would be feeling, again, hopeless, overwhelmed, numbed out. It takes days to be able to kind of reintegrate, right? Then it's too much for the system. If people don't allow any openness, sometimes they get so active that the losses are just sort of cut off. And people sometimes find that they're almost numb to any emotion. That's a sign that it might be good to go toward some of those loss activities. So, what are some tips? So we kind of talked about the overall picture of the stages of grief. We recognize that there's something that called a prolonged grief disorder that really does require additional help because it can be so impactful in terms of daily functioning. And then we talked about this push-pull of grieving. So what are some tips when you're working with your own grief? And again, I want to say grief in a really broad way. People that have gone through deaths, of course, of loved ones, physical health challenges, trauma, loss of identity in jobs, loss of relationships, all of that. They all thread together in lots of different ways. So no matter what the loss is, big or small, really allowing yourself space to acknowledge that. And I work with clients sometimes who will say, well, other people have it worse than me. I hear that a lot. And I really want in this presentation to recognize that all grief, all losses matter. And whatever your feeling is, it's important to recognize because it also ties into other losses, right? So what might be coming up now has roots in sometimes childhood. So don't pretend your feelings don't matter. It's really important, right? And to be kind when the feelings and the waves come up. Social connection really helps. So, I think especially this time of year, even if it's being able to do a little walk with a friend, a phone call, whatever it is, if you're noticing you're tending to isolate, that this is going to be really important to find some social connection. It is really helpful to share feelings, being able to label feelings. There's an expression in mindfulness, we call it name it to tame it. So when we can name, like, oh, I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling some sadness today. Being able to say it out loud, to name it, especially with someone that you care about or cares about you, can actually ease our heart when we're really struggling, right? So it's hard to be vulnerable. I know it is, but it also can have this healing quality as well. Working with actually a ritual that honors the person. How do you want to spend the holidays this year? Is there a very small ritual to include the person, at your table, or something that would help you remember, a holiday from years ago? And then seeking professional help really is helpful to talk to somebody, a neutral person that can just hear how you're doing, because our soothing behaviors are often not the healthiest, right? I was working with a client recently who said, I don't think I've ever learned any soothing behaviors. I don't think I know any, right? or healthy soothing behaviors, because typically we go toward the ones that are really easy to access. They're quick, right? Alcohol, overeating, numbing out, but soothing activities that are actually healing, which could include exercise, could include talking to somebody. It could include working on feeling the feelings in our bodies, letting waves of grief come and go. Some of these other suggestions, creating rituals. But we don't know how to do that unless someone teaches us, right? They're not always intuitive how to soothe ourselves. So if you are struggling, it's really, really helpful to reach out. And I've done many sessions with people. We just might even do one session just talking about a grief reaction and some ways to manage that grief, right? So it doesn't mean necessarily you're going to need 70 sessions of psychotherapy to work through it, but it can be helpful to get some ideas and some extra support. So many of you, in addition to having your own grief and loss feelings, are in contact with someone else who's struggling, right? And so what are some tips? And these are kind of this idea of what not to do and what to do. And so presence really matters, the check-in. And one of the things I like to remind people to do is to set a firm commitment after each contact with somebody. So let's say someone's having a really difficult time, right? So you might check in, and then you might say, hey, I'm going to check in next Friday. So I like the idea of a concrete check-in, making sure that someone knows not only that you care, but that you're going to be following up. Your supportive presence makes a huge difference. It is less what you say, but the fact that you're consistent in what you're saying and that you're showing up. Now, you've probably heard this before, but it is really helpful to ask people, what do they need, right? How can I help you? People often get upset, if they feel like, you're not you're not really showing up in the way that they need. So ask people, right? If you're afraid of doing the wrong thing, ask someone like, what would be helpful, right? It's surprising what people will say. Sometimes it is as simple as I need to go for a walk, but sometimes it is, I'm really overwhelmed and I'm struggling to cook, right? Or I'm struggling to bring my kids to carpool, really important to have a non-judgmental stance about grief. And you don't have to be a therapist, you don't have to educate people about stages of grief and finding meaning in grief. It is not helpful. I like to just name it. If someone is saying they're struggling, I'll say, yeah, that sounds really painful, or it sounds like a lot of grief here. I'm sorry. So help if we talked about naming it for ourselves, but we can name it for other people or ask them. It sounds like there's a lot of pain here, right? So the continued reach out, making a commitment, how often you're going to reach out to the person, and then doing it. And then this last one, which sometimes is not intuitive, which is asking the person if they're comfortable talking about it. I will ask people when they're coping with the loss, what was your mom like? What was your dad like? If they don't want to go there, they'll tell me. But often people will start to share, and it unlocks some of the things that have been stuck for a while. And it does sometimes help with the making meaning part too. I'm not trying to get somebody to suddenly make meaning in their lives, but it can be really helpful to be able to talk about the person, right? Because if no one speaks about the person, again, these things get locked away. And so the idea of inviting someone if they want to. So I like a lot of permission language. If you'd like, no pressure. I'm just curious. I'd love to hear about stories about how you used to celebrate the holidays with your family. So it's invitation, it's curious, it's holding space. And it's not much more than that, right? But it's the consistency of showing up. So mindfulness and self-compassion really help too. I put this in because it's really helpful when we are activated to be able to check in and see how we're actually doing, right? Because we get through the holidays, we can go on autopilot and we can get through, but often we're kind of cut off from ourselves. So if we're not paying attention to how we're feeling, how do we soothe? How do we address our pain if we don't even know if we're experiencing that? So one of the things I like to do is, as often as possible, taking a moment to do a soft landing, right? Coming to our senses, just taking 2, 3, 4 breaths. I think I'll do that now, right? Just taking that moment to come back into this moment. Because if we're on autopilot, who knows even how we're doing, right? And so I might even ask, sometimes we talk about this kind of three-part question, not just how am I doing, but how's my breathing? That's one question. How am I feeling in my body? And maybe even taking a moment to scan your body, noticing if there's any tension in your body. And then how am I breathing? How am I feeling in my body? And then what emotions are here right now? So very kind of quick check-in. And you don't have to have the answer, but mindfulness helps us recognize, oh, there may be something uncomfortable here, or I may need a moment, right? I may actually need to sit down, lay down, take a rest because I'm not feeling great, right? So mindfulness helps us to notice when we're getting stuck or when we're overwhelmed and we're kind of on autopilot. So these are questions that you might consider asking yourself. And I like to think about it as an inquiry. Inquiry is a term we use in psychology. It's a question that we don't know the answer to. It's a question that we can ask ourselves with curiosity and kindness. What do I need? What do I need right now? When I feel this way, what do I need? These are questions to kind of think about. And then sometimes we need a lot of tenderness. And my hand goes to my heart right away because I might need some soothing touch. I might need some comfort, reassurance, validation if I'm really struggling. And sometimes I need fierceness. I need to protect myself. If I know I'm going to be activated by family members or situations or taking on too much, I might need to be setting boundaries. That might be a compassionate way to work with my grief this holiday season is I'm not doing it. I'm not cooking. I'm not taking this all on. So starting to think about what are your needs and how do you meet your needs? Is it tender and soft? Is it more boundaries and a more fierce way of approaching the situation? So we can do soothing and we can do tender and we can do fierce. And sometimes we go back and forth. But starting to get into the habit, of asking yourself, what do I need? Because most of us have this habit of ignoring our needs and going on autopilot and just keep going, keep going, keep going. And when that happens, there's no place for grief. There's no place and space for loss. There's no place to even be able to share and be open and vulnerable. And while that can be protective, as we learned earlier, that push-pull, it also keeps us stuck. And sometimes we end up having a bigger fall after the holidays, right? So I want all of you to think about how you can periodically, you might even put little stickies on your computer, asking yourself this compassionate question. What do I need? What do I need right now? And when I feel this way, what do I need? So sometimes to answer that question, we can ask ourselves, I call them the 4 Ns, right? So number one is to notice my experience. So let's say, for example, I'm feeling pretty stressed, but I don't know what I need. So why is she asking me to answer that question when I have no idea? All right, so this is a way to think about that. So first is noticing my experience. I'm coming in really stressed. And then I actually check in inside and do my inquiry. What do I need? Okay, well, right now, if I notice my experience, I am really tired. My body feels tired. I am exhausted. Okay. So I notice in my body what I'm feeling and then I name it. Oh my gosh, there's a lot of fatigue here. I'm really overtired. What's my need? Okay, that's the third end. So I name it, I notice it, I name it, and then my need. And the need might be something like, oh, I need rest. I need to set a boundary because I can't keep doing all these things. So starting to ask yourself, what is my deeper need? Sometimes I'll ask people to consider what's the immediate need and what's a deeper need. It might be I actually what could we do? What's our next small step? Maybe it's looking at my calendar and saying, realistically, I'm going to need to shift. I'm not going to be able to do all of these things, right? So just a couple of other tips as we come to the end, and I want to save time for questions. So tender self-compassion can be this idea of being soothing, right? So soothing and calming, reassuring and validating, right? So these are ways I put my hand to my heart because that's my favorite one. But comfort, soothing, it could be, I like a lot of sensory techniques like a warm bath, blankets, especially during this time of year, massage, yoga, ways that are really soothing for the nervous system, doing breath practice, ways that we can take our nervous system from a heightened state to a more relaxed state. Okay. So these are tender practices. And then those fierce practices, like we said earlier, saying no. I put stickies sometimes on my computer or tell clients to do this too, of what are my boundary statements, which are classic ones I like are something like, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now, but thank you for asking, right? If you have trouble saying no. Um, what are ways to protect and conserve your energy? And sometimes we need to motivate ourselves like, okay, I know I need to reach out to somebody. I'm going to reach out to X, Y, and Z, and you're making a plan of action. So sometimes being fierce means making an action plan. I need to take a walk. I need to reach out to my therapist. I haven't reached out to that person in a while, right? So tender and fierce can help us when we're not sure what we need. And then finally, we can do practices. This is a practice we don't have time for today, but this is one of the practices I like to share, which is a self-compassion break, where we can actually meet a difficult emotion with kindness and with compassion. We have many of these practices on our website, our LCL website. So that's something you can find some of these practices if you're looking for some quick ones to do some soothing and some calming practices. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay, I think the internet's sort of held up, so that's exciting.
Tracy, that was so wonderful. So many huge takeaways, and I think so helpful in a lot of ways, again, especially during this holiday season. Few things that stood out to me is not necessarily, I think a lot of people often have a hard time with death and not knowing what to say. And the fact is that it's okay to check in with somebody and say, how are you doing? And let them tell you, okay, I don't want to talk about it. Or if they do, it gives them that opening. So that was a big takeaway. Something else you mentioned about the restoration activities. I wonder if sometimes people might feel guilty laughing or enjoying. And so I think that was helpful to also hear out loud that it's okay to do those things. Um, and then also some great practical tips. So I thought that was really some nice things to share. So definitely appreciate it. Just going to a couple of comments. Somebody did write, another don't say is the name of the deceased person would not want you to be sad. So anyway, that was something I think again was helpful to
Yeah.
hear you talk about.
Yeah, I love I thank you. That's a really important point. Like, no directive. I think like when we give people directives, even if we think it's supportive, it can really activate and feel really disempowering. So it's really helpful to be able to, just ask the person, rather than telling them what they should feel, asking them. And I love open-ended questions rather than telling people directions, because if they're in more of the restoration activity focus, then telling them something about their loved one may be really, really too much at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
I also like to give people a lot of empowering statements of like trusting themselves, so that they don't feel like they have to put on a face or pretend to be feeling differently than they are.
Yeah. Somebody wrote very helpful, thank you. And then another comment was, I think the idea of push and pull and that we can trust our own process was very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I really and I really feel like the protections our systems use are vital, that helps us survive. And when we try to mess with that system, when we try to tell people to feel differently, get over it, there's a time frame, like we're not trusting this intuitive, natural healing that our bodies and our minds do. I really trust people. We know ourselves, right? And so I think it's helpful for us to know if we're in a push-pull, but it is really, really important to allow ourselves to have that process.
Somebody else made a comment, great seminar. I practice transcendental meditation, TM, which is very helpful. Do you have any thoughts on TM? I've heard a lot of things about it, but
TM's been around as one of the most well-researched kinds of meditation since Herbert Benson in the 1970s used it to look at the stress response in the body. And he found that people that practice transcendental meditation could lower their blood pressure, had all these good physiological benefits. Honestly, I mean, those of you who have seen some of the other seminars I've done on mindfulness practice is so important to help us know what's happening in our system and helping us regulate. So TM, mindfulness of the breath, all of those are really, really helpful.
excellent. Another comment, this was very helpful, perfect to build up my armor for the holidays.
Yeah, I like, and armor is a good, fierce self-compassion practice. And I do like the idea of recognizing when you need to armor, name it. It's really good to say, I need to armor. This is part of my own practice because this is going to help me from getting overwhelmed. So we can, sort of wear that armor proudly and recognize it's actually a self-care strategy to armor up. That's why I like the fierce compassion and the tender, because we need them at different times. And so if you realize like, yeah, you know what, I'm going into the season, I need lots of protections. Excellent. Trust that. Yeah.
Excellent. Another comment, thank you for sharing the various elements of grief, and in particular, the tips. I'd recommend that in the future presentations, carve out 10 to 15 minutes of actual mindfulness practice, and similar to the weekly 20-minute practice. And so, yes, within that presentation. So as a reminder, Tracy does do weekly mindfulness and some yoga. And so I encourage folks to join her for that.
Yes. Thanks. Yes, absolutely. I think if we can start to do a regular practice, especially this time of year, and for some people, even a few minutes, but like you said, 10 to 15 minutes, it makes such a difference. Yeah, so please come join on our Tuesdays because we have fun. We talk about topics, but we do get a good practice session in. And, even if it's once a week, you're doing benefit to yourself, especially around this time of year where we're noticing all these things coming up.
Another question is, how can prolonged grief affect all other areas of a person's life, not just at Christmas?
Yeah, so prolonged grief really does impact all facets of life. And and one of the ways that we know it's becoming prolonged grief is that we're still not able to return to our activities of daily living in a way that gives us meaning and purpose, right? We talked about that sixth stage of grieving, right? Meaning and purpose, and there's an absence of that. And so we might see more chronic physical and emotional distress on more days than not. And it really interferes with regular activities that create happiness and joy for us. So it is absolutely beyond just this season. Now, prolonged grief is a really serious, it takes, I mean, as you saw from that criteria, it is over a year in duration, and people have to have pretty significant distress to meet that criteria. But it is so important to get support if you know someone who's in a prolonged grief state. That doesn't mean that our grieving goes away after a year, but if someone is in this prolonged grief state and they're having a real significant impact on their daily life, that's when it's really helpful to get help.
Excellent, thank you. Another comment, this was an excellent webinar. Thank you, Dr. Myers and LCL. Again, thanks, Tracy, for great advice. And then this was a follow-up Again, somebody else made a comment. This was timely and very helpful. A follow-up to what you had just mentioned about the prolonged grief is how and where to get help with prolonged grief.
Yeah. So, there's two sort of different streams, and people can do both of them. So, I definitely recommend a grief group could be very helpful because it's led and facilitated by a grief counselor. So hospitals have it, hospice has it. If you're talking about a death of a loved one in particular, that can be very beneficial because you have other people in the room that are, or a virtual room. A lot of them are virtual. So that's one way that people find can be very helpful when people are feeling like there's a prolonged grief. And then individual therapy, just like you'd go to an individual counselor for anxiety or depression or any mental health condition, the same, right? So it could be a particular focus of treatment to work with a counselor, psychologist, mental health, LCSW around prolonged grief. So it could be individual or it could be a grief group format. Both are really helpful. And some people do both as well.
Excellent. We have another question. Can you provide registration info on the group you mentioned that you lead on Tuesdays?
Yes. So it's actually, if you go on actually, I think I can give you the link. Let's see if I can get on it.
She's asking about the mindfulness. There's
Yeah. Let's see if I could. I have limited internet bandwidth here, so I'm not sure if I can open it from here, but
while she's looking that up, folks, please feel free to go to our website, lclma.org, and you can take a look at all of the groups that we offer, and you can register right from there.
All right, I've got it. Let's see if I can text it to myself. Yes, let's see. And also the yoga group. We do a yoga group also once a week. So both of those are ways to give yourself a little extra support. All right, I got that. I am about to paste it in. Maybe. Okay, here we go. There we go. Ah.
Excellent. That went through. I see it.
Yeah.
And somebody else also mentioned the mindfulness group is great. And then somebody was looking to meet individually. So once again, if you go to our website, lclma.org, you'll see a section where you can sign up for a consultation. And you are able to ask for somebody specifically. You have the option of first person available because not everyone is able to meet immediately. Or if you are looking to meet specifically with Tracy, you do have that option of noting that on that request. Okay, somebody said, can you please send the same link you just posted in the chat? They can't see it. So let me,
You can maybe, I don't know.
yeah, let me see if I can do that. To everyone, here we go.
Oh yeah, maybe I didn't. Oh, I did. Yeah.
Okay, so that's
Perfect.
there.
Great.
Please sign up. Again, these are such helpful groups. Just also looking to see any other comments. Is it possible to get a recorded copy of this talk for sharing with someone who would benefit from this program? So we do record, and the recording is posted on our website within a few days. And then we also send out a recording directly to everyone who did sign up. So you should keep an eye out in your email for that. If you don't see it, again, please visit our website and you can do a search and you can see it that way.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, we're right at 1 o'clock. I don't see any other questions or comments. So once again, thank you so much. This was truly such a wonderful topic, clearly timely, but advice you can use all year round. So thank you once again, Tracy, and we will see everybody next month in January.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.